Okay. So we are in the book of Habakkuk, and we are looking at hang on, I'm just going to get up, walk over here for a second. I'll be right back. Sorry, we're looking at chapter 2 and 3 tonight. So we can be in chapter 2 and 3. That's where we'll be. So last week in the first chapter of Habakkuk, what did we have? What was the general theme of the chapter? How did it go?
Well, Habakkuk was complaining.
Okay.
And he's actually been a little nervy about it.
Okay, Habakkuk complaining, kind of being nervy with God about what's he complaining about?
How long?
Injustice. Okay. How long will these?
It's like call for help.
Yeah.
You do not listen.
Right.
He's kind of calling God out, in my opinion.
Yeah. He's
unusual.
It's like the Psalms. It sounds a lot like the Psalms. Some of the Psalms where the psalmist is calling out to God. How long will you let these things happen? How long will you let this injustice take place? How long? We cry out to you. I cry out to you, and you don't listen. And so So there's this. It's a complaint. It's a complaint. And so how does God answer?
He says, just wait.
Okay.
The answer is in works. I'm working it out. In other words, you have to be patient.
And
But
Jeff,
it's not an answer that Habakkuk
No,
likes, because God intends to use a sinful people to punish Israel or Judah, I guess. Is it Judah or
Judah. I'm going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. I'm raising up the Babylonians, and they're going to come to power, and they're going to deal with the injustice in Judah, the injustice among my people. So God says, in effect, I am going to deal with this. This is something that I'm going to take care of. So what does Habakkuk think about that?
I sure wasn't happy.
He says, how can you do that? How can you idly look at traitors and remain silent when it swallows up the man more righteous than he? He's talking about the same issue. And he blames God, who left these people alone without a ruler.
You've made people like I like that. It's an interesting comparison he uses. By raising up the Babylonians, you made everybody like fish in the sea, right? The Babylonians are just going to come along and yank them out and feast on them, and then they're not even going to give you glory for what they accomplished. They're going to worship their nets and their fish hooks, and that's because that's where their strength is. So Habakkuk can't understand. How could you, first of all, how could you let injustice go on among, the Jewish people? How could you let injustice go on among your people? And then how could you use these other people to deal with it? Do you understand Habakkuk's complaint?
It doesn't seem right.
Yeah.
He's a righteous man. See, and God doesn't seem to be very righteous.
He certainly feels like he's a righteous person. Yeah.
He's a godly man.
And so he's struggling with how does God do this? How does God let these things happen? And I mean, this sounds very contemporary. Habakkuk's complaint is one that people have had about God, about religion, about faith for time immemorial, I guess, right? How do you believe in a God tolerates injustice? How do you believe in a God that lets people run rampant with violence and tyranny and oppression? How do you let this happen? I think we can all kind of relate to that question, that struggle. We talked last week about how even when you try to come up with an answer of some kind to it, it risks trivializing, right? And so we kind of struggle even with, how do you respond to it, to that question in a way that doesn't trivialize the pain and the fear and the doubt that's sort of tied up in it. So that's what Habakkuk is struggling with. That's sort of the theme of this book. He's an interesting prophet in this way, because this is one of the places in the Bible, and again, a bit of a similarity to Jonah. He's a prophet, but he doesn't sound like a prophet sometimes, right? You're sort of catching a prophet behind the scenes. This isn't the message he thought he was going to have, right? And think about it, Habakkuk probably was preaching to the people of Judah that you've got to treat one another with justice. There's got to be justice. There's got to be righteousness. And God, he was probably preaching God's judgment, and yet God's judgment wasn't coming. And so he's struggling with, what exactly am I doing here? And there's a reason for it. And so you're kind of catching a behind the scenes glimpse of a prophet sort of struggling with his
I think what we see is a man with a conscience, Some
Sure.
people seem to have a strong conscience, and he's got a conflict with his conscience. Something's not right here, and he's trying to figure it out, and then he's questioning God.
Yeah, so he ends his first or his second speech to God with, "I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I'll look to see what he'll say to me and what answer I'm to give to this complaint." So he essentially says, I'm going to stay right here until God gives me an answer. I'm going to stay right here until this is figured out. What do you think about his attitude there? I'm going to stay right here until I get an answer.
You may be there a long time, but no, it's good. I think
You admire his persistence, don't you? He doesn't want to just write this off. He wants to deal with this. He wants to come to terms with this in some way. And I do admire him for that. I think that the fact that he wants to have this out so that he can have some sort of answer in his mind is admirable. But we don't always get the answers we want. But it's admirable to want that, isn't it? I think it's good. I think it's better than just giving up entirely, right? And I think that's what too many people do. They struggle with these theological questions, about God, and they give up one way or the other. They give up by just sort of embracing the trite and the easy, or they give up by just sort of rejecting God entirely. And I think this is better this is superior to both of those directions.
It reminds me that of something that just happened last night. We were watching a movie on TV, and Charlie was, as the movie was going on, Charlie was, well, what happens next? And was trying to engage us to find out what was going on. And the response was, if you would just be quiet and watch, you'd find out. It'll be explained. I think sometimes, people get so upset and decide they're going to start talking about stuff and discussing and debating stuff that they're not alert to actually see what God is going to do. And there are, these things about a watchman, have echoed down into Christian thinking too. And of course, Jesus tells us to be a watchman also. I don't think it's drawing off of the Habakkuk analogy. I think it's drawing off of, I can't remember which, it was Ezekiel, the passage about a watchman. But still, you know, that's a good thing to do, to just see what God is going to do, how he may reveal himself, instead of getting so caught up in thinking, you know, or by debating that it'll get resolved.
Yeah.
Or maybe he won't reveal himself.
And that's possible too.
The question is always, according to what timeline? We should be used to that, because we're in an age where the dramatic show that goes across multiple seasons is in its heyday. I think Lost is a good example, where you'll have the episodic plot, and sometimes plots that go across a few episodes, or a plot arc that goes across an entire season, and then of course the plot arc that goes across the entire show.
Mhm.
The writers can plan over. God is planning for the entire show, amongst other things, and we tend to see the episodic cause and effect only.
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of,
but-
go ahead.
But to what Christy said, which is true, but even then, isn't the waiting and the watching credited to us as righteousness? I mean, because that's that expectation. Even in the New Testament, again, is it Anna who was watching for the fulfillment, of what was coming? That's an admirable thing that is portrayed in Scripture. So whether or not we get an answer, the trying, the watching is itself productive, apparently.
I think so. I think it is. And if we're willing to do some of that hard work, which is going, sometimes going without an answer for a while, sometimes, just waiting in the silence and trying to see what happens. So let's read a little more into chapter 2 here. So the Lord replies, starting in verse 2. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to read through all of chapter 2. And because I think we kind of need to sort of see the whole response in one chunk here. So I'm just going to read through chapter 2 here. The Lord replied, write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets, so that a herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end, and it will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay. The waiting, right? As I said, I was going to read through, but let's pause a minute. The waiting, the waiting while the revelation comes to its appointed time, right? Waiting until it will come. Though it linger, wait for it. Verse 4 then, see, the enemy is puffed up. His desires are not upright, but the righteous person will live by his faithfulness. Indeed, wine betrays him. He is arrogant and never at rest, because he is as greedy as the grave, and like death is never satisfied. He gathers to himself all the nations and takes captive all the people. Will not all of them taunt him with ridicule and scorn, saying, woe to him who piles up stolen goods and makes himself wealthy by extortion. How long must this go on? Will not your creditors suddenly arise? Will they not wake up and make you tremble? Then you will become their prey, because you've plundered many nations. The peoples who are left will plunder you. For you have shed human blood. You've destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them. Woe builds his house by unjust gain, setting his nest on high to his. You have plotted the ruin of many peoples, shaming your own house, forfeiting your life. The stones of the wall will cry out, and the beams of the woodwork will echo. Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and establishes a town by injustice. Has not the Lord Almighty determined that the people's labor is only fuel for the fire, that the nations exhaust themselves for nothing? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Woe to him who gives drink to his neighbors, pouring it from the wineskin till they're drunk, so that he can gaze on their naked bodies. You'll be filled with shame instead of glory. Now it's your turn. Drink and let your nakedness be exposed. The cup from the Lord's right hand is coming around to you, and disgrace will cover your glory. The violence you have done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, and your destruction of animals will terrify you. For you have shed human blood, you destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them. Of what value is an idol carved by a craftsman, or an image that teaches lies? For the one who makes it trusts in his own creation. He makes idols that cannot speak. Woe to him who says to wood, come to life, or to lifeless stone, wake up. Can it give guidance? It's covered with gold and silver. There is no breath in it. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. So wait for it. It's coming. And what's coming? What does God say is coming?
Destruction of the Babylonians.
Okay.
In 70 years.
You see through this how God is going to turn it around on them, right? You drink the thing about giving his neighbor drink, and actually, probably a better translation in Hebrew has to do with, it's the Babylonians making the nations drink the wine of their anger and their wrath, and God is going to turn and give them the same thing, his wrath, anger, the cup of his wrath and anger. He's turning it around, right? You've plundered many nations, so the peoples who are left will plunder you. Your creditors will suddenly arise. That's an interesting, there's some people that you owe something, and they're gonna collect, that's coming. You've plotted the ruin of many people, and so it's gonna come down. What you've built is gonna be destroyed, the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. So the idea is everybody will know the Lord. All that it's one of those pictures that you have in the prophets sometimes of this sort of worldwide acknowledgement of God as his glory. What else? What else do you see there?
Well, about the Babylonians are idol worshipers. And God is saying, your idols that have been carved and made by men are worthless.
Right. What do they offer? What do they have? But the contrast, right? In the meantime, while you're worshiping your worthless idols, the Lord is in his holy temple, and the earth will be silent before him. So, yeah, God is
God is living, is what.
God is alive, yeah.
It says there's no breath in it, it's
Right.
lifeless stone.
Right.
Or wood.
Right.
The silence is interesting. The only other place I can think of where that's mentioned is in Revelation.
Silence in heaven for half an hour.
The last,
Yeah, I think the idea is, I mean, what can they say, right? What do you say when God is revealed?
It strikes me, it strikes me as kind of, okay, I'm telling you the vision, things will work out in the end. If it seems like it's not happening fast enough, it will in the end. And then kind of a reminder, you know what the principles are.
Yeah.
You know how to be good. Remember, being evil doesn't pay. Stick to the principles I taught you and be quiet before God. Like it's a little bit of all of these things, I'm laying out how it's going to be in the end, those principles. I mean, that's how I interpret it. It's kind of like a reminder that evil doesn't pay. Remember that.
I think you're right. The whole, the biblical idea of reaping what you sow, right? And that comes up in the prophets a lot. You will reap what you sow. And the Babylonians too, the Judeans are about to reap what they've been sowing, but so will the Babylonians. And so will anybody else who oppresses others. And eventually, we're getting to the place where the whole world will be silent before the Lord. And this, this won't have to happen anymore. I think it's interesting. It begins with write it down. This is one of the few places in the Old Testament that talks about writing something down, and the idea of just what we're looking at, right? A written text. But you write it down, he says, so that it can be read, so that it can be promulgated, so that it can be preserved. You write it down, it's make it legible so that, NIV says a herald may run with it. Another way to read it is the idea of running is sort of metaphorical, and it's whoever's reading it will be able to read it easily. His eye will be able to run over it, run through it without too much trouble. I think that's really interesting that you have this thing about writing it down, because when you write something down, well, what happens?
Well, one thing, it indicates that you're serious about something.
Okay.
You write something down, somebody else did.
Okay.
That to me is an indication you're serious, and like you say, it'll have longevity.
Longevity is one of the things I was thinking. When you write something down, other generations can read, right? So, I mean, I think that's interesting. God says, write this down to Habakkuk, and centuries later, here we are reading what Habakkuk wrote down about God's judgment, about the way that he responds to these questions.
Implication is that comfortable hearing is getting a vision from God. You get this riotous collection of images, and it doesn't make any sense. That's another reason they write them down. You process
Clarity. Yeah.
and maybe they won't make any sense in your immediate time period anyway, because they're not supposed to.
Yeah. Clarity.
Generations can look back and say, "Oh, this makes more sense now."
I mean, I think this is why we have, one of the that God revealed himself in a way that revealed himself through writing, revealed himself through people writing down what they experienced with God, what God told them, because it sustains it, and it allows future generations to see the scale. Because I think you hit on something, Matt. God's kind of saying to Habakkuk, this thing is going to be on a different scale than you're imagining, right? We all want to see our stories rounded off nicely, right? We all want to see our questions answered in our lifetime. We all want to see everything kind of come around to full circle. I mean, I think that's natural. I think it's okay that we want that, but we won't always see that. And part of the writing it down is so that future generations can see both the struggles and how God has responded.
Well, and in fact, if you look at that passage that we've just been talking about in chapter 2, verse 2, and chapter 2, verse 3, he's talking about writing it down. And when you get to chapter 2, verse 4, presumably that's the beginning of the message that is supposed to be written down and remembered. And in fact, the little bit there in that initial verse or initial statement, the righteous shall live by faith, becomes a pretty influential little squib of Habakkuk.
Yep.
And you wouldn't necessarily pick that out of all the verses, but it is the beginning apparently of that declaration And it was marked by New Testament writers as a very important idea. And maybe it is the idea that sort of underlines his entire message here, that you got to release some of your concern as to your control over what's going to happen and other things. I don't know. I'll just throw it out there, that's something we should try to think about what Habakkuk is saying.
I think you're right. I think it's fascinating. I agree too, Ron. It's interesting that, I mean, Paul twice in Romans and Galatians quotes it to talk about the righteousness that comes from God through faith. And so he quotes from Habakkuk, the righteous will live by his faith. Now maybe he means it a little differently than, or uses it a little differently than Habakkuk, but I don't think a lot. I think Habakkuk's point and Paul's point are very similar. That the way you live, the way you survive, the way you get through whatever it is you have to get through is that you live by faith. You live by this, and the NIV here says faithfulness. And I think that's not a bad way to interpret, to translate that word. That you live by hanging in. You survive by, when you don't know the answers, you dig in deeper to God and to his trustworthiness, and you put your faith and your trust in him. And it's also what you said, Christy. I mean, part of faith is being faithful, right? And doing the things that you know are right, that you know you should be doing, that you know please God. And it's in that you survive. You live that way, you do those things that are good, and you trust in God's power, which is, I think, we'll go back and gets to. But I do think
Interesting.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's interesting that, like so many things, we can take one scripture and kind of misuse it too, because in the Bible, you could say from this, when someone questions and maybe even does like Habakkuk and kind of gets after God, or when something terrible happens to me, I'm probably gonna shake my fist a little bit too because of the suffering and so forth. You could use this and say, well, just stop that. Be faithful. And that's not really the message of the Bible either. I mean, Jesus really stopped and with the on the road, on the walk to Emmaus, and honored the questioning, and Mary is honored for her learning and an inquisitive mind. And Habakkuk of all people is able to push back at God. So you got a little bit of a tug of war here, right? Like, I don't think they're actually in conflict, but it appears to me that both places are acceptable as long as we're still coming to God with them.
Yes.
And I was thinking last week, like questioning God and saying, I always hesitate to I'm very hesitant to kind of think I know what God's point of view is. I think that's a dangerous place to go, but I can't help but wonder if the ultimate answer in some of these, why does this happen? Why is the world like this? Why, is you can't understand it. Like, I'm God, you're a person. Even, it's not that I'm keeping something from you. You can't. You're a lot like me, but you can't understand it because you're not God. And I can't help but wonder if that's a little bit of this back and forth is, yes, I want you to think, but you're not God. I don't know. I'm wondering if we might not be capable of understanding, or I'm pretty sure we're not capable.
Yeah, I think that's often the case. Yeah, and I like what you're saying about how the questions and are not contraindicative of faith, right? And in fact, I mean, one of the ways you show faith is you go to God and you say, why? To me, that's one of the great ways to demonstrate your faith in God. Because if you didn't believe that he had an answer, if you didn't believe that he was God, why bother to ask the question, right? to go to him with that question is a way of saying, as Habakkuk does here, I don't get it, and I'd sure like an explanation. And I don't think he's giving God an ultimatum as much as he's just saying, please, in some way, right? Now he says, now the scale is beyond what you think, and it's going to take longer than you imagine. But here's what's happening. Here's what's going on.
But I've heard people. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I've heard even folks in church will say things like, "I know it's wrong to question," or "I just got to tell myself not to ask God that." I mean, I've heard that taught, not I'm not saying literally like from a sermon or anything, but I've heard that reference, that we think we have to explain everything, and if we can't, we have to go back to say, well, you just have to have faith.
Right.
And it's not wrong, but it's not understanding the issue to say that.
I appreciate the humility that goes into that, if that's what's motivating it. Because you're right, there's things we can't understand, right? But I don't think it's wrong to question it. In fact, as you look at Habakkuk and you look at Job and you look at the psalmists and you look at Jesus, and it's not wrong to have those struggles, right? It's not wrong to have those moments, those times of doubt and question and in fact, again, I think that's one of the ways that we demonstrate faith, by going back to God with those questions and asking him why, and waiting on the ramparts until he says something.
But Jesus even complimented that, right? With the woman and the unrighteous judge, and just consistently kept going back and back and back. And I mean, it's a little bit of a puzzling parable, but the idea does seem to be that God doesn't mind if you nag at him.
Will the Son of Man will he keep putting off his children who cry out to him? And the answer, we assume, there's no. So let's just round it off with this beautiful prayer here at the end, chapter 3. A prayer of Habakkuk the prophet on Shagayanath. So it's on Shagayanath, just so you know. We don't know what Shagayanath is exactly. It's probably some sort of instrument or some sort of musical notation, but we don't know for certain what that means. It's in some of the Psalms as well. This is really a psalm. Verse 2, Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds, Lord. Repeat them in our day. In our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. Don't you like that? I've heard of your great acts. Repeat them in our day. That's beautiful. That's an amazing, expression of his awe of God and his desire to see God act. So then he gives this sort of poetic description of probably, at least to some degree, the Exodus and other things. God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran, that's Sinai. His glory covered the heavens, and his praise filled the earth. His splendor was like the sunrise. Rays flashed from his hand where his power was hidden. Plague went before him. Pestilence followed his steps. He stood and shook the earth. He looked and made the nations tremble. The ancient mountains crumbled and the age-old hills collapsed, but he marches on forever. So it's this, this is what, these are the stories we've heard, right? Of God coming from Sinai and leading his people and leading them into this promised land, and the lightning and the plague and the pestilence, and God doing all these things. I saw the tents of Cushan in distress, the dwellings of Midian in anguish. Were you angry with the rivers, Lord? Was your wrath against the streams? Did you rage against the sea when you rode your horses and your chariots to victory? You uncovered your bow, you called for many arrows, you split the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and writhed, torrents of water swept by. The deep roared and lifted its waves on high. Sun and moon stood still in the heavens at the glint of your flying arrows, at the lightning of your flashing spear. In wrath you strode through the earth, and in anger you threshed the nations. You came out to deliver your anointed one. You crushed the leader of the land of wickedness. You stripped him from head to foot. With his home spear you pierced his head when his warriors stormed out to scatter us, gloating as though about to devour the wretched who were in hiding. You trampled the sea with your horses, churning the great waters. So there's this picture of God in these cataclysmic acts, dealing with all of the people who are threatening his people, who are threatening Israel. And remember what he said. We've heard about it. Now repeat these deeds in our day. We need the same thing. God, we need the same deliverance. We need your power to be seen in that way. I heard and my heart pounded. My lips quivered at the sound. Decay crept into my bones and my legs trembled. Yet I will wait patiently for the day of calamity to come on the nation in vagueness. He did all this stuff, God, in the past, and we need you to do it now, but I will wait patiently. That's what he's come to, right? That's what Habakkuk has come around to. He's come from how long, O Lord, to our I'll wait. Now, patiently doesn't mean he likes it. Patiently doesn't mean he's happy about it. Patiently just means what it sounds like, right? I'm going to be patient. I'm going to trust that this is going to happen. And then maybe the last three verses, maybe one of the greatest affirmations of faith in the Bible. Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails, and the fields produce no fruit, though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God, my Savior. Sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to tread on the heights. I really like that ending. Okay, I haven't gotten the answers I wanted. Some of the things I've heard are kind of scary, in fact. And all that stuff about the fig tree and the grapes and what is that indicating?
That the land is going to be laid waste.
Bad year. Bad crop year.
Bad economic collapse, essentially, right? An agricultural economy, this is economic collapse. All of the crops are failing, and it's all coming apart at the seams, right? And there's no way, we can make it economically. But I will rejoice in the Lord. I'll be joyful in God, my Savior. And then that gives me strength. He makes my feet like I think the idea is, the way is rocky and it's steep, but God's gonna give me footing and enable me to navigate and get through. And even I don't know if treading on the heights is meant to sound what it's, but to me it almost sounds like, and even in the difficult times, God is going to lift me up to the high places, and give me some joy and some peace and some glory and all of this.
One of the things I like about, oh, sorry. I was going to say, one of the things I like about these verses, and, in fact, in the way that Habakkuk is laid out in general, is it emphasizes an aspect of faith that sometimes we overlook. It's this idea that, faith isn't truly faith unless you're trusting in God in spite of the circumstances. It's easy to have faith in God whenever he shows you and explains exactly how it's going to look out and everything feels good, prosperity gospel, right? It's quite another thing to have faith and trust in God whenever, because of your faith, all sorts of terrible things are happening. Whenever you to truly believe that God loves you, even when it feels like your world's falling in, is quite something.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Trust when things are not going well. And and it is easy it is easy to worship God and thank God and trust in him when all is well. But this is hard. This is that hurdle of faith that Habakkuk gets to, where all right, I'm going to wait, and I'm going to rejoice in what I can rejoice in, and I'm going to celebrate the strength that God gives me in this time to lift me up and keep my footing and get me through. I think it's really beautiful. There's actually a old devotional book that uses language from the King James Version. Deer is a hind in the King James Version. And the title of the devotional book is Hind's Feet on High Places. I always thought that was a nice title. That's a nice one.
This is a poetic book, and it's so filled with very vivid images that you can really, imagine. And earlier in the book too, there are so many vivid images.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
So we have Habakkuk been borrowing from Psalm 18, which would have been before him. Using the same image.
Read Psalm 18. What's the image?
He makes my feet like those of.
Yeah.
It's Psalm 18.
Yeah, it's.
That's why it came before. Right?
Yeah, probably. Although I don't know what does that psalm say about itself? What's the tagline of it?
1833.
Depending on who wrote it when.
Uh-huh.
But certainly possible. And Habakkuk Habakkuk 3 is a psalm. There are even people who would argue that chapter 3 wasn't originally part of it. I don't think there's any real documentary evidence of that. It's just that it's a little more psalm-like, but I don't see any reason to think that that's the case. I think it's just Habakkuk's response to this is this psalm, this beautiful psalm.
Reminds me of Isaiah, where it says God gives you wings like eagles.
Yes. Yep. You'll run and not grow weary. You'll walk and not faint.
Psalm 18 is supposed to be David
David.
after the victory over Saul.
Yeah. Well, then probably it's something that he borrowed. It's not the only place either, I think, when there are deer on the heights.
He actually reminds me a lot of Job. Think about it, right?
Yeah.
Because he was unsatisfied. He was satisfied with God's righteousness after struggling with God.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great thing.
But Patrick, I think you did stop before the final tagline, right?
Yes. The director of music on my stringed instruments.
Yeah, I have. This prayer is for the song leader. It is to be accompanied by stringed instruments. Song leader, that's good. That makes us feel good. It is to be accompanied by stringed instruments. Well, we may need to get back to this idea of we got to be a little bit open to the fact that sometimes things aren't as clear as we may want them to be.
Perfectly fair to me.
At least here, I'm sure it is, Alan, but it does seem that a prophet of God is directing that this be accompanied by musical instruments here.
I don't know what else.
It is a different time, I agree, but it does seem that God has not been eternally offended when praise to him is accompanied by musical instruments.
Certainly, we know that happened in the temple. Yeah.
So
So that's Habakkuk. That's the gist of the book of Habakkuk. And I don't know. I feel like it says something to me, at least, about the questions that I struggle with. That God's judgment doesn't always seem, God's justice, God's righteousness doesn't always come about as quickly as I want, in the ways that I want. And honestly, that's probably a good thing, because I would certainly get it wrong, and yet it's okay to ask, it's okay to question, it's okay to lift up those questions to God. When you're watching the news or hearing another terrible story, or another person is telling you about a tragedy in their life, I think it makes us sympathetic. It makes us human. It's inhuman to hear somebody struggling and not be able to share in those questions. And that's where Habakkuk is. His humanity, his need for this, this justice is what drives him to this place. And that's a good thing. It's good to have that heart that wants justice and wants what's right, and wants God to act. There's nothing I think we have to change about that. But then I think what Habakkuk reminds me of is to find those places where I can thank him, even though things aren't the way I want. I can thank him, and I can worship him, and I can find joy in him, and I can even lean on him for strength and for guidance in these difficult, rocky times, where he'll help me put my feet in the right place and get through what I have to get through. And there's joy in that, and that's faith. That's what it is. And as Christians, I mean, we have even a little different perspective from Habakkuk, right? Because we know Jesus walked through these difficult times and these he dealt with injustice. He dealt, firsthand, right, with injustice and unrighteousness and wickedness and violence, and in the end said, not your will, but not my will, but your will, and walked to the cross, and that's what we do. We follow him in that, and there's resurrection.
One small lesson I kind of walk away from this with is we church folks don't need to feel obligated to have an answer for every question that comes to us.
I think that's really good to remember. Sometimes I feel that pressure. I've got to be able to answer my skeptical friend. No, you don't have to. I mean, if you can, and if you can have a conversation with a person, but we don't have to feel that pressure of trying to pretend that we know what God's up to all the time. We don't, and we won't. We don't even have that privilege as believers to know that.
Because we can't see all that God is doing.
That's right. That's exactly right.
And he'll do it
I'm
right.
struck by how sometimes, our perspective is so limited by even like just what the news chooses to cover, right? There's a lot going on in the world, that's bigger than what's on my screen on my phone, you know? And God's in that and involved in that. And I can easily have my perspective swayed by, you know, what's right in front of me, whether it's, you know, a particular news source or whether it's whatever it is, my own prejudices, my own assumptions. I can easily have my perspective swayed and miss a lot of what God is doing elsewhere. Or even what he's doing in those situations that I don't know about.
So the First Peter says, be ready to give an answer. I guess that's someone that always jokes me, but an answer for the reason for your hope.
Yes.
That doesn't mean give every answer.
Right. Yeah, First Peter says, be ready, you know, always be ready to give an answer. And we feel pressure for that, but no, it's for the hope that you have. And sometimes when we don't have the other answers, that's the best time to give an answer about the hope that we have, you know.
Well, have you ever heard, just overheard a conversation where like 2 6-year-olds are talking to each other and one is explaining something to the other? And sometimes you just think this is a hoot. I mean, I mean, they've gotten this information and they're trying to convey it one. And I sometimes think we lose track of the fact to God, our explanations are probably akin to those 6-year-olds trying to communicate what they understand. And God, being God, can't, we don't see it all. Like, it's still through a mirror darkly, right? We're not seeing everything. And I think at times it's like my elementary school teacher, I heard a kid said, well, what if I subtract 4 from 2? And you can't do that. I mean, that was her answer, right? You can't do that. Well, that was not an untrue answer, but it was gauged to the audience. I mean, it was, but it was gauged to the audience, right? Because they wouldn't have understood that. And this sort of plays in with Christy. You know, we got to be cautious. We do understand a lot of stuff God has tried to explain, but we've got to remember that his explanation was probably geared to where we are. And that may leave a lot out there still.
I've been fascinated with Nicodemus lately, and what Jesus says that I think is incredibly deep when, I mean, here, I'm giving Jesus credit for being deep. That shows something wrong in and of itself. The wind blows where it chooses, and you hear the sound of it, but you do not know where it comes from or where it goes. So it is with everyone who is born of the Spirit. That's not people that don't get it yet. That's those of us who have gotten the Spirit. We still don't get it. I think that's a fascinating thing Jesus told Nicodemus.
Yeah.
We don't know what happened with Habakkuk, do we? He's a cipher. We don't know if he lived to see the Babylonians come in. We don't know any of that.
I believe he is the prophet that in one of the apocryphal books is like picked up by his hair and taken to
he's taken to see Tobit, I think, isn't he?
To see who?
Isn't he taken to see Tobit?
Yes, that's it. It's in the book of Tobit. Yes,
yeah,
he is. Yeah, but yeah, as far as in scripture goes, we don't know much about him other than that. Just he's kind of left. We're kind of left with a cliffhanger here, right? No, I guess it's not a cliffhanger because Habakkuk comes around to, I'm going to be all right, and I'm going to wait. I'm going to trust, and I'm going to believe, and I'm going to rejoice, and I guess we presume that he did. Well, thanks very much, guys and ladies. Good to chat with you all. Hope you all have a great week.
You too, Patrick. Everybody.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you,
Take
everyone.
care.
Have a good week.
Be safe. Good night.
Good night.
everybody.